On the night of the intercept, Pilot Officer Geoffrey Robinson stared into a beam of light, so powerful it turned the black sky above Essex into something resembling daylight, and somewhere ahead of him, caught dead center in that glare, hung the silhouette of a German bomber. He had 30 seconds, perhaps less, before the light would fail, or the bomber would bank clear of it. And he had been told more than once by more than one squadron mate that the aircraft flying just ahead of him carrying that searchlight was a joke. A dangerous, half-finished idea that would get them both killed before it ever caught a single enemy aircraft. Robinson pushed the throttle forward anyway. He had waited months for this moment, and so had the strange, cumbersome machine flying blind formation just yards from his wingtip. To understand why a fighter pilot in 1941 would find himself flying at night, in formation, inches from another aircraft that carried no guns of its own, but instead an enormous carbon arc searchlight bolted into its nose, you have to go back to the problem that was killing Britain's night fighter effort in the autumn and winter of 1940. The Luftwaffe had shifted from daylight raids to night bombing, and fighter command had almost nothing to answer it with. Radar existed, but the airborne radar sets fitted to early night fighters were crude, short-ranged, and desperately difficult for a single pilot to interpret while also flying the aircraft and searching the sky. Ground control could point a fighter roughly at a bomber. Actually seeing it in cloud in blackout darkness over a blacked-out country was another matter entirely. Pilots were being sent up night after night and coming back having seen nothing at all, while London and Coventry and Liverpool burned beneath them. Into this gap stepped Wing Commander William Helmore, a Fleet Air Arm officer, engineer, and something of an inventor, who had an idea that sounded, on paper, almost absurdly simple. If the problem was that fighters couldn't see their targets in the dark, why not build an aircraft whose entire job was to illuminate the target for someone else? Helmore's concept took a twin-engined Douglas Havoc, the RAF's adaptation of the American DB-7 Boston light bomber, stripped out its offensive armament, fitted it with one of the early airborne interception radar sets, and packed its nose with an enormous searchlight, developed with General Electric, rated at a candle power so extreme that pilots who saw it demonstrated on the ground said it was like staring into an exploding sun. The idea was that the Havoc would use its radar to close in on a bomber in the dark, then snap on the searchlight at close range, freezing the enemy aircraft in a cone of blinding white light. Tucked in formation behind and beside the Havoc, invisible in the darkness, would fly a standard single-seat fighter, a Hurricane, whose pilot would need no radar and no special training to finish the job. He simply had to see the enemy bomber lit up ahead of him and shoot. It was an idea born of genuine desperation, and it had the backing of men at the very top of the RAF hierarchy who were prepared to try almost anything to stop the bombing. Within weeks of Helmore first proposing it, resources were being diverted to bring the concept to life, and by the autumn of 1940, the first unit built around the idea, number 1451 flight, was forming at RAF Hunsdon in Hertfordshire. More flights followed in quick succession, each one pairing a handful of Turbinlite-equipped Havocs with a full squadron of single-seat fighters, usually Hurricanes, sometimes Defiants. On paper, Fighter Command now had an answer to the night Blitz. In practice, almost nobody who actually had to fly the thing believed in it. The skepticism started with the basic physics of what these crews were being asked to do. Formation flying in daylight is difficult enough for young pilots with only a few hundred hours in their logbooks. Formation flying at night, with no light showing, no horizon visible, and only the vague grey shape of another aircraft's exhaust glow to fly on, was something else entirely. The Hurricane pilots had to hold position on the Havoc, using nothing but faint shielded formation, lights, fitted to the bigger aircraft, sometimes at a distance of only 100 feet, in cloud, in turbulence, while both aircraft maneuvered to try to intercept a bomber neither of them could yet see. One wrong move, one moment of vertigo, or misjudged distance, and two aircraft could collide in total darkness over the English countryside. It happened. Training accidents and operational losses to collision and disorientation cost the Turbinlite squadrons, aircraft and crews before a single German bomber had even been caught in one of Helmore's searchlights. Then there was the radar itself. The AI sets fitted to the Havocs in late 1940 and through 1941 were early marks, unreliable, short-ranged and fiendishly difficult to interpret. A radar operator crouched over a small cathode ray tube in the back of a lightless aircraft, watching flickering green traces that might be a bomber, might be a rain shower, might be nothing at all, then had to talk his pilot onto a contact, using a running commentary of ranges and bearings, while the Havoc pilot tried simultaneously to fly the aircraft, hold height in cloud, and keep formation with a fighter he could barely see off his wing. Even when everything worked exactly as it should, by the time the Havoc pilot judged the range close enough to risk switching on the searchlight, the bomber crew, who could see the glow building even before the beam fully illuminated them, often had just enough warning to dive, turn, or dive into cloud and vanish before the trailing Hurricane pilot ever got a clean shot. Squadron gossip did not take long to turn damning. Fighter pilots posted to Turbinlite-affiliated squadrons, units like 87, 151, 253, and 486, among others that rotated through the role alongside their more conventional duties, grumbled that they were being asked to risk their necks, flying blind formation on an aircraft that, more often than not, produced nothing but a wasted, freezing night patrol and a hair-raising return to base in weather nobody would otherwise have flown in. Ground crews joked bitterly about the Havocs as expensive torches with wings. Some pilots refused to hide their contempt even to visiting officers. And word reached fighter command that morale in several of the Turbinlite flights was, in blunt terms, poor. The whole apparatus, critics argued, was solving the wrong problem. It multiplied the difficulty of night interception by requiring two aircraft, two crews, and a hazardous formation join-up, instead of simply making a single aircraft's radar good enough to do the job alone. And yet Helmore and his supporters kept pointing to the same argument, and it was not a foolish one. The alternative in late 1940 was nothing. Standard single-seat night fighters with no radar at all were achieving almost no interceptions whatsoever against the bomber streams pounding British cities, guided in by radio beams and dead reckoning through cloud that made a defending fighter's unaided eyes almost useless. If a Searchlight aircraft, however clumsy, however dangerous to fly, could put even a handful of bombers into a Hurricane pilot's gun sight that would otherwise have slipped through entirely untouched, then it had done something no other tactic then in service could claim. The program was allowed to grow through the winter of 1940 into 1941, more flights forming, More squadrons rotated through Turbinlite cooperation duties, more young pilots sent up on nights, when common sense alone might have kept them on the ground. It was against this backdrop of institutional stubbornness and squadron-level ridicule that men like Robinson found themselves flying the tactic for real, night after night, waiting for the one interception that would prove the doubters wrong or confirm everything they already suspected. The pattern of a typical Turbinlite sortie became familiar to the crews who flew it through the winter of 1940 into 1941. Ground control would vector the havoc, using early warning radar information, relayed from the coast into the rough vicinity of an incoming raid. The Havoc's own AI radar operator would then hunt for a contact in the murk of returns and false echoes, calling ranges back to his pilot in clipped urgent shorthand as the gap closed from thousands of yards to hundreds. All the while, the accompanying hurricane held its desperately close formation, its pilot flying almost entirely on the dim shape of the Havoc ahead, trusting a radar operator he had never met to bring them both into position, without flying them straight into the enemy or into each other. When the Havoc pilot judged the range right, usually somewhere under 1,000 feet, he would flip the switch that fed the enormous arc lamp in the nose, and the sky would turn white. For a few seconds, if everything had gone right, a Dornier or a Heinkel would hang there in the beam like a moth pinned to a board, and the Hurricane pilot, eyes already adjusted to the dark, would have his one chance. But those few seconds were exactly that. Few. Bomber crews learned quickly to watch for the telltale glow building in the darkness before the beam fully locked on, and a sharp diving turn into cloud could take them clear before the trailing fighter had so much as opened fire. Time and again through 1941, crews reported getting a Havoc into range, snapping on the light and watching their quarry dive away into blackness. Within seconds, the interception blown. The whole elaborate, dangerous maneuver for nothing. Across the many Turbinlite flights operating through this period, confirmed successes were vanishingly rare, and every pilot in the program knew it. Whole squadrons rotated through months of cooperation duty, flying dozens of hazardous night sorties between them, without a single Turbinlite-directed kill to show for it. The frustration was compounded by the fact that, in the very same period, a rival approach was quietly proving itself far more effective. Single-seat night fighters were being phased out in favor of dedicated two-seat night fighters, bow fighters, and from 1942 onwards, mosquitoes, carrying both the radar and the guns in one aircraft, flown by a pilot and a radar operator working as a single crew rather than two separate aircraft trying to cooperate through the dark. These aircraft did not need a blinding searchlight to give the pilot a target. The improving AI radar sets, especially once centimetric versions arrived from 1941 onwards, could bring a single aircraft close enough for its pilot to pick up a visual contact, using nothing but the glow of exhaust stubs or the dark shape of a bomber against slightly less dark sky. Kill numbers for these radar-equipped night fighters climbed steadily through 1941 and into 1942, in stark contrast to the Turbinlite squadron's bare handful of claims. It would have been easy, and in hindsight it looks almost inevitable, for the whole Turbinlite program to have been quietly cancelled by the middle of 1941. It was not. Instead, through a mixture of institutional momentum, Helmore's continued advocacy, and a fighter command leadership still nervous about having too few answers to the Blitz, the flights were expanded and, in September 1941, formally redesignated as full squadrons, numbered in the 530s. More aircraft, more aircrew, more resources were committed to a tactic that its own pilots had spent a year telling anyone who would listen was fundamentally flawed. Training continued. Accidents continued alongside it. And still, night after night, the Havocs and the Hurricanes went up into weather that grounded more sensible operations, hunting for the handful of seconds of illuminated opportunity that so rarely came. It was in this stretch of the program's life, deep into its most doubted and derided phase, that Geoffrey Robinson's Hurricane found itself locked in formation on a Turbinlite Havoc over Essex, and that a bomber, for once, did not escape the light in time. The Vector had come in from ground control shortly after the raid crossed the coast, one more contact among dozens threading through the night sky towards London. And for the first 20 minutes, it had gone exactly the way every previous sortie Robinson had flown seemed to go. The Havoc's radar operator called contact, lost it, called it again, and the two aircraft banked together through broken cloud, with Robinson's whole concentration fixed on the faint smudge of the Havoc's formation lights ahead of him, trusting men he could not see to bring him somewhere useful. Then the calls sharpened, range closing, height matching, and the sky in front of Robinson's canopy turned without warning into blinding white daylight. There, caught square in the beam, before it had time to react, was a Heinkel, close enough that Robinson could see the black crosses on its wings and the sudden, panicked snap of its turn as its crew realized what had happened to them. He had no time to think about the months of scorn heaped on the very aircraft that had put this bomber in front of him. He simply fired, closing the gap as the Heinkel tried to dive clear of the light, and held the burst as long as the fleeting seconds of illumination allowed. The bomber staggered, trailing smoke, and dropped out of the beam into darkness before Robinson could confirm what had become of it. The Havoc's own light snapping off almost as quickly as it had appeared to avoid giving away its own position to any other aircraft in the vicinity. Interceptions like this one, rare, hard won, and often only partially confirmed, given the difficulty of tracking a damaged aircraft's fate in blacked-out darkness over enemy or contested territory, represented the very best the Turbinlite concept ever managed to deliver, and there were only a handful of them across the entire life of the program. They were enough to keep faith alive among the tactic's most committed supporters, who could point to them as proof of concept whenever critics in fighter command's higher reaches asked pointed questions about resources spent for so little return. But they were nowhere near enough to answer the fundamental case against Turbinlite, which was not that it could never work, but that it worked so rarely, at such disproportionate cost in aircraft, training hours, and risk to aircrew, that it could never be scaled into a serious answer to the night Blitz. By 1942, that case had become impossible to ignore. The improving radar-equipped night fighter squadrons were, by comparison, transforming the night skies over Britain. Crews flying bow fighters, working as integrated two-man teams with radar and guns in the same aircraft, were achieving kill rates that made the entire elaborate choreography of Havoc and Hurricane look like exactly what its detractors had always called it: a clever idea overtaken by better engineering, before it ever had the chance to prove itself at scale. The German night bombing campaign against Britain was also easing through 1942, as the Luftwaffe's attention turned east and to other fronts, reducing the urgency that had justified persisting with Turbinlite in the first place. The end when it came, was administrative rather than dramatic. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1942, Fighter Command quietly wound down the Turbinlite squadrons, redistributing their aircrew into conventional night fighter units and retiring the Havocs from the Searchlight role entirely. By early 1943, the whole program that had once commanded multiple dedicated flights, then full squadrons, then years of debate and resources, had effectively ceased to exist. Wing Commander Helmore's great gamble, born of a genuine and understandable desperation in the darkest months of the Blitz, closed not with a decisive victory or a public reckoning, but with paperwork, reassignments, and aircraft quietly struck off strength. What the Turbinlite squadrons left behind was not a legacy of kills. By any measure, their tally across more than 2 years of operational life remained painfully small set against the scale of effort invested, but a legacy of lessons learned the hard way, at real cost to the men who flew it. It confirmed in the plainest possible terms that the future of night air defense lay in putting radar and weapons into the hands of a single integrated crew, not in splitting the problem across 2 separate aircraft trying to cooperate blind in the dark. That lesson shaped the design and doctrine of night fighter forces for the rest of the war and beyond, feeding directly into the successful Beaufighter and Mosquito squadrons that went on to inflict serious and sustained damage on the Luftwaffe's night bomber force through 1943 and 1944. For the pilots who flew the Turbinlite Havocs and the Hurricanes that trailed them, it left a different kind of legacy. A quiet, largely unrecorded chapter of the war in which ordinary young airmen were sent up night after night into some of the most genuinely hazardous flying conditions the RAF asked of anyone during the conflict, in pursuit of an idea that history has judged, not unfairly, to have been mostly a failure. They were not chasing glory in the way fighter pilots of the Battle of Britain had been chasing it a few months earlier, in bright summer skies with cheering crowds watching from the ground. They were flying blind, in freezing cockpits, trusting strangers in another aircraft they could barely see, for the sake of a handful of seconds of light that might, if everything went right, give one man one chance at one bomber. Most nights, nothing came of it at all. A few nights like the one over Essex it did. And in a war fought as much by desperate improvisation as by decisive strategy, that willingness to keep trying something that had been mocked, doubted, and quietly dismissed by almost everyone who flew, it says as much about the character of the men involved as any of the more celebrated victories of the Royal Air Force's long fight to defend Britain's skies after dark.